Conversations podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Conversations podcast. Today, we have Leigh Cox with us. Leigh Cox has joined NAATI on secondment from the Department of Home Affairs to implement the new language service provider endorsement model. The model is expected to play a formative role in helping to reshape the sector for the better, so that individuals can gain more timely and higher quality language services. Leigh was formerly the Director of Language Services Policy in the Australian Government's Department of Home Affairs. Welcome, Leigh. Thank you for coming.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, so I think everybody's really excited about the language service provider endorsement model, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there. I know you've done a few webinars to answer some of those questions, but since it's the hottest topic in our industry at the moment, we wanted to invite you on the podcast to discuss it, see what's been happening and what we can expect from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's very timely and lovely to be here, and fire away.
All right, so just to get started, can you give us a brief overview of what the LSP endorsement model is and what we can expect?
Yeah, sure. Okay, Elvira. So the language service provider model is at its heart government's attempt to try and set up a level of standards across the language services sector in terms of the providers who typically bid for kind of the larger size or larger scale T&I contracts across government. So many of the listeners probably know this, but NAATI is wholly owned and jointly owned by Australian state and territory governments. I suppose they meet semi-regularly and discuss a range of issues that impact multicultural Australia. One of the ongoing things we've been talking about, I was even on this podcast some time ago talking about sustainability, and this is really intended to be a first initiative, at least that would deal with kind of standardisation of organisational accountability issues and service quality issues as well. And that's what this model is really intended to do. And how it will work is that, at least in theory, a government may go out to tender for language services, and they may choose to make being an endorsed provider one of the requirements. In much the same way that translators and interpreters are often asked by governments through guidelines that, make sure you're using NAATI credentialed interpreters or translators. Often always said. I suppose what this is intending to do is to say, make sure you use a NAATI endorsed provider.
Yeah. I like how you said that it's the first initiative in this sense, and sustainability is definitely something that many in the industry worry about. So it's really great to see the government involved to try and work in this sense. How do you think the model can achieve this? Can achieve improving the sustainability of the sector?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a big question, because I suppose the model will do some things and it won't do other things. So it doesn't address remuneration, and perhaps we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what it does try to do, and in complete fairness to the language service providers that operate services in Australia, it is increasingly difficult to deliver a service in any location and have a complete awareness of what an appropriate standard might look like. Most governments have in place language service guidelines. They're not necessarily all the same. This model is intending to kind of provide a standardisation approach across all of those providers. So for the first time, we might be able to establish a level of standard and work with the sector and those businesses to try and drive further improvements. So, for example, one of the measures is about submitting service-related data to NAATI. So that could be things like, was a NAATI credential practitioner used, provide their credential number, the language, a range of other material that often gets provided to the contracted agency directly, and they'll have a look and go, yes, that's great, but probably move on from that. Whereas if NAATI is in a position to aggregate that data and publish it back in a really safe way, but publish it back for all to see and use, we could potentially, on behalf of governments, try and drive a whole series of improvements in terms of supporting the clients who require these services. Because ultimately, that's really what this is about. It's about those individuals who might be in vulnerable situations and can't gain access to information, making sure that they can access those services.
Of course. And what is the timeline for the implementation of the model?
Look, it's ambitious. So governments asked NAATI to drive this in December of last year, and most of this year has been spent doing fact finding. So there's been a number of discussion papers and lots of consultations to determine what, I suppose, a draft model could look like. We're getting towards the pointy end now. So we're spending all of this month consulting. At the beginning of November, it'll go to governments for their consideration. And the plan is that from the first week of January 2026, we are beginning to endorse LSPs. So only a couple of months.
Yeah, that is ambitious, I suppose. But it's as I understand it, it's definitely not all going to change at once in January. It's going to be whenever a new tender comes up, that tender will go to an endorsed LSP if it's for a government tender. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yes, theoretically, yes. So each government will still have to go out to tender. So that's wholly done by that particular government. So the government would go out for language services. We're having a lot of discussions with a number of federal agencies about tenders that are likely to take place relatively early next year. That being endorsed would be a requirement. So they'd still need to bid for the work, and the agency would still assess them against a range of criteria. But one of those criteria would be, are you an endorsed provider, yes or no? So I suppose, January is just the start of this, because I suspect what we'll see is that other states and territories will be rolling out the requirement to be endorsed if and as they go back out to market for their work. So it's probably going to take realistically a few years. And NAATI is also committed to evaluating this measure as well to make sure that if there's any unintended consequences or outcomes, we're addressing those things, making sure the settings are right, that agencies understand them properly. So it is a complex project. That is for sure.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to what you said earlier, that of course the goal is to help the clients who are in need of language services. So if this is the goal, how can you, talking about the impact of this model, how do you think the model is going to benefit practitioners on the other hand? So we can see how it helps the client, but how is it going to help practitioners?
Well, what I would say initially to that, I mean, there are 6 or 7 different measures, at least in the draft, that an LSP needs to meet, at least in draft. I'll just speak to a couple of them at the moment. So right now we know that there are many settings where unaccredited bilingual workers are being used in lieu of NAATI credentialed interpreters or translators. That appears to be more and more prevalent as the years go on. One of the requirements in the model is that a provider needs to use NAATI credentialed practitioners where they're available. So we would expect, as a result of that, to see people who've made the time and energy and the commitment to go and get skilled up and to sit the tests, that those individuals will be receiving, as a result of that change, an increased proportion of work. There is another measure in there about making sure that LSPs are prioritising assignments according to the highest level of credentialed practitioner. So similarly, we would expect to see people who've spent more time or gone into an area of specialisation to, in effect, receive more work. So I suppose that element of it really speaks to a reprofessionalisation of the sector. Maybe that's a bit harsh. I'm not. Maybe it's strengthening the professionalisation of the sector over the long term. The caveat to all of that is the wages also need to be addressed, and this doesn't address that. Yes, and perhaps we can have a chat about that as well.
Yeah, we'll get to that for
Elvira.
sure.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So if only certified practitioners will be employed, or that's going to be the goal, to try and employ certified practitioners, is NAATI concerned about a loss of available practitioners and maybe demand and supply issues as a result?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. So I think the immediate answer is probably no. So there's two elements to that. So there are times where it would be appropriate to use a non-credentialed interpreter, because you will know, and your listeners will know, that there are a small number of language groups where it's not possible to get a credential, or you can get an RPI and that's fine. But there are language groups where there are no people who classify themselves as interpreters doing work. So there's some Pacific Island countries in that category. Tuvalu is a great example. So I would expect, under very limited circumstances, LSPs may still choose to use those. To get to the kind of heart of your question, though, which is like, if we're only using credentialed workers, and if that's a limited pool, does that then mean we're creating greater gaps? One of the advantages in the flexibility of the model, I suppose, is that we're giving endorsed LSPs a series of time to help bring any uncertified bilingual workers or interpreters up to a level of standard, and NAATI has kindly agreed to invest in that and to support those practitioners to sit tests and do all of those things too. So I suppose we don't want to create an environment whereby there are a reduction of services, and we'll need to see what happens out of an evaluation and carefully monitor that. But I am confident that by giving people a lead in time and actually supporting the providers to upskill their workforce, that we could potentially be both increasing the number of people that are skilled at the same time as there might be a greater need of use as well.
And the model actually specifies that certified practitioners should be prioritized subject to the appropriateness of the assignment and the ability to complete the task. Is that still LSPs who are going to be determining the appropriateness and the ability to complete assignments?
Well, yes, it would. They're good points that actually came up through the course of our consultations, because there are certain circumstances, and I'll share a couple of examples with you, where we're talking about appropriateness or ability. So, for example, when we say appropriateness, we're meaning things like if it's a female client who is going to get some support in a sensitive health issue, they may want a female interpreter. So if the only person is a male interpreter, it may not be appropriate that is the individual supporting that client. So that would be a matter of appropriateness.
Yeah.
Ability to complete a task might be where an interpreter lives in another state or territory, and actually the matter really requires someone to be face-to-face. And maybe it's not a pre-booking, maybe it's on demand. So that really goes to quite physically someone's ability to actually undertake that work. The important thing here is we'd like to set these as the, 1 out of 10 times things, really the minority of cases. So we want to be careful in kind of creating these caveats that we don't inevitably create an environment which just allows anyone to use anyone. So we are having conversations at the moment about, well, what if we're going to ask for reporting, what benchmarks can we put in place? An LSP actually suggested the idea that maybe one of the reporting requirements is that an LSP needs to provide a benchmark. Maybe they need to show that at least 90% of all interpreting and translating cases went to people with a NAATI credential. So it's not a case of them never using one because we've provided a carve out, but how can we hold them accountable and how can we support them to meet the needs of the community?
And I've also read on the draft of the model that you are considering minimum work assignment periods. Can you elaborate on what that is exactly?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the things that's kind of come up throughout the duration of consultations, including around sustainability. So there is no real clear standard or minimum benchmark in the sector at the moment that necessitates how long an individual should be remunerated in accordance with. So if you're on a interpreting call, let's say it's a telephone interpreting assignment, and you're on the call for 10 minutes, do you get paid for 10 minutes, or is there a minimum that's appropriate? This is obviously quite significant in face-to-face assignments, and often when you might have to fund car parking and things like that. Courts always come up in that context. So we're trying to have a conversation, I suppose, with providers, but also equally governments about, well, should there be standards around that stuff? And if so, what should they be? Those things might be different depending upon the format and what have you. This is probably one of those areas, though, where governments are as much responsible for setting those as an LSP is for introducing them as well. Because, it has to be said, we work in kind of an ecosystem, and that in many cases, providers are operating in direct accordance with whatever that particular agency might want or need, and they're under budget pressures, and individuals are trying to deliver a business in accordance with those things as much as the ultimate person who's heard out of this is either the interpreter or even the client. So when it comes to minimum standards, it's going to be really important to make sure that we can find some agreement both with the providers, but similarly with all of the governments as well. Yeah.
So do you think that the implementation of these different elements in the model could result in increased costs for LSP or increased work for that matter?
We are trying to make it the case that it wouldn't necessarily require or result in additional regulatory costs. Look, the data requirement's probably the biggest one, but even in that example, we're being very transparent and trying to work with providers on the types of data they currently collect anyway, to reduce the level of duplication and make it easier for them to provide material that they're already collecting. Actually, one of the benefits that might eventually arise out of something like this, and don't hold me to it necessarily, but we actually spoke to one state government today about them looking at reducing the number of reporting requirements that a provider might need to meet on the basis that they'd already be providing it to NAATI, and NAATI could on-share that. So rather than kind of seeing this as an additional impost, looking at where pressure can be taken off in other areas that would be meaningful. There's at the moment, NAATI is saying, the endorsement process, the application will not come at any cost to a provider. I suspect that to be the case for the first couple of years at the very least. Obviously, when an interpreter or translator needs to get credentialed, there's a cost. So NAATI might eventually be in a position where it needs to charge something that's nominal or notional just to try and offset some of the administrative costs. But hopefully that's not major. Similarly, with the costs of uplifting the skills of the workforce, NAATI is really investing in that. So we're trying to alleviate the pressure off the provider. So no, I don't think it's going to have a major kind of financial impost, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the remuneration then. As you said, there's nothing addressing it in the model. Was this a deliberate choice?
Yeah, it was. So To kind of reiterate what I was saying at the beginning, states and territories and the Australian government, for that matter, directed NAATI to establish a model that would deal with kind of a range of kind of organisational accountability issues. Remuneration was deliberately left out for a couple of reasons. One, because NAATI doesn't have significant industrial expertise by which to develop remuneration standards that would be equitable and appropriate. And so I suppose you could come up with figures based on some best practice standards, but it also needs to be deliverable by a provider and supported by that government that's ultimately going to be paying for those services. And if you think of the model as governments directing NAATI, which they own, to then impose a set of requirements on providers, having NAATI set wages would be the one element where NAATI, the organisation, is actually dictating to governments which own it how much it should be paying.
Mm-hmm.
So at a practical level, it can't work for NAATI to set or force or compel people to pay a certain amount of money. That's not to say that NAATI doesn't have a role in providing advice to governments on a range of these kinds of issues, like around remuneration, around the sustainability of the sector, what's happening, what's driving those things. And individuals can even go onto NAATI's webpage right now, have a look at the model. And we provided an interim report that's been published, and it includes some advice NAATI's, I suppose, provided back to governments around the types of elements that need to be addressed if this sector is to become truly sustainable. And that does include finding a way forward on difficult conversations around remuneration, because people are spending a lot of time in the industry doing a lot of work. And I suppose I don't need to tell you or your listeners how precarious that might be for people who spend a lot of time doing their work. We care about it. We just can't include it in the model, which is difficult.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned at the beginning that this is the first of some initiatives to come to make sure that the sector is sustainable. Do you think you will be bringing forward other initiatives in this sense?
Well, it's a great question. So I suppose I'd like to see, and I'm seeing individuals talking about issues around wages all the time. I suppose it's a question I can't really answer because it's a little bit of a black ball, or I don't know how you quite describe that. But the environment is good for addressing these issues. We've seen at a government level conversations about productivity and loss of productivity, and we know that there are people spending longer in hospital than they should because there's no interpreter. Court cases are being held over because there's no interpreter. I know we've got passionate ministers across the country. The Australian Minister Ali, she's a migrant by background of Egyptian heritage and has worked in English language skilling and has a very good and solid understanding of the sector more broadly as well. And so I do think that the environment is ripe for additional initiatives that would go to the heart of these issues. It's just a matter of when and what that might look like.
Yeah, I think I agree there with you. I think you can definitely see a more interest, not just from the government, but from everybody in the industry to try and make sure that we are headed in a positive direction in that sense. It's definitely been a topic for several years now.
Totally. And you even look a few weeks ago, Multicultural New South Wales were advertising for full-time interpreters. And I think the wage was in the $110,000 range for full-time interpreters. And yes, granted, that might have been in the dominant kind of language groups. But that is a positive thing to see from a government in terms of trying to, I suppose, course correct.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when you obviously this model is going to be used to endorse LSPs that are looking to get tenders, government tenders. Is it going to be benefiting LSPs that are active in the private sector in any way?
It's a great question. And we've been asked that through the consultation process as well. I mean, it does just apply to government tenders, but that's not to say that a private organisation may ultimately choose to use an endorsed provider in much the same way that people just kind of expect or ask to use a NAATI credentialed interpreter or a translator without necessarily thinking about whether it applies to them or not. So, yeah, I think we might see some really positive shifts outside of just the government sector. And this is possibly one of those areas where the government can kind of influence the broader sector because it does drive so much of the spending in terms of service use and uptake.
The final measure that I wanted to ask you about is the code of conduct. So there's a mention of a code of conduct for LSPs. Who developed this code of conduct?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's currently under development. We've actually set up a couple of different consultation forums at the moment, and the draft code is in a SharePoint site that's currently got comments all over it. But to answer your question, we've tried to take material from other areas, and that is true across all of the measures. So a core component of the code of conduct is currently what AALC use, so the Australasian Association of Language Companies. Their members need to agree to a code of conduct, and that does include a set of kind of service-related conditions. So I suppose that was the proxy for the framework. However, I suppose there are areas in that need to be updated, and there are also suggestions that NAATI thinks would benefit from more rigorous standards. So, for example, the AALC code refers to highly skilled interpreters, doesn't refer to NAATI certified. Obviously, we've already talked about the need to use NAATI certified, so we'd like to see that change. There are some other areas like abiding by any relevant laws that are within your state or territory. Now, that could just come across as a given, like, of course. But if you look at industries like the childcare sector that are dealing with some really horrific issues around people not necessarily having a working with vulnerable people check, which is a legal requirement, we would like to highlight some of those requirements to make sure that all providers are in agreement that these things need to be provided. That's also true for, paying superannuation, for example, and a range of other kind of conditions as well. We're also having conversations about including adherence with language services guidelines in the jurisdiction you're operating within. Often those guidelines that kind of sit dormant on government websites are kind of quickly flicked but not necessarily well read or understood. We are asking providers to have a pretty good handle on the materials in there and actually put them to use. So rather than kind of them just sitting back, including them. There are other requirements, but they've escaped me right now. The important point is to say that we do want it to be rigorous and robust, but we want to co-design it. We want to design it with LSPs at the table, and we are trying to do that. And actually, the feedback we've been getting from LSPs has been really terrific.
Yeah, so an LSP, if an LSP abides by this code of conduct and fulfills the requirements of the model, they will be endorsed. Is that going to be very strict? Do they have to fulfill all the requirements in order to be endorsed?
So yes, they do. There might be under certain areas where they're not meeting a target in full. So, for example, there might be providers out there with a really large number of unaccredited bilingual workers. We'd like to work with providers in a positive manner. NAATI isn't a regulatory authority. It doesn't have those kinds of powers. What we'd like to do is to work with those providers in a kind of positive way, not about kind of shaming anyone, but kind of facilitating a bit of a cultural transformation. So we'd like to see, let's just use that example of a huge proportion of certified workers. We'd like to see that number shift, and we'd like to see the use of credentials go up over the kind of course of the journey. Now, provided people are working with NAATI on in a positive way and making that shift over time, they're not going to be knocked back, I would say. If they're operating in good faith, meeting the requirements as best as they can, NAATI will take a very positive view towards them.
And how is the public going to be able to tell if an LSP is endorsed?
Well, great question. So very similar to what we do with interpreters and translators, the plan is to provide a logo of sorts, highlighting, that a provider is endorsed. We're also kind of having internal conversations at the moment about our systems and providing like reference numbers and the like that the public could be aware of with a provider. So if, they've got any concerns or anything, they can kind of reach out to NAATI anonymously. Simultaneously, NAATI is also working on a kind of a public awareness campaign that's likely to kick off around January. It's not designed for the endorsement model per se, but we are hoping to use that as a bit of a springboard to promote those providers. And we're also looking at what we can do in an equitable way, not just to promote the model, but to promote those providers that go through that process. So, so when we go to events and they're NAATI related events or a language services forum or similar, provide information about that kind of highlights them equally to say, hey, look, these providers, have committed to doing a stellar job and supporting the sector, and obviously leave it up to the purchasers to hopefully pick one of those providers.
Well, the monitoring of the whole situation that falls back onto NAATI, and that's going to be a huge job as well. Did you have to develop a whole new system to do this?
Yeah, partly yes and partly no. So thankfully, we've got a very good IT team that are kind of looking at the digital back end of NAATI and how we can kind of retrofit the endorsement into recent changes that have already been established. In terms of the monitoring and the evaluation of it, we are having some kind of discrete conversations with some firms that kind of have expertise in evaluating measures not dissimilar to this around the types of metrics we could use to get a good handle on the proxy for success or challenges within the model. So we're having those kind of conversations at the moment. We are confident that we'll be able to evaluate this as providers go through that process, see what kind of industry-wide changes take place to then be in a position to provide advice back to governments at a later stage. But evaluation is definitely front of mind. Often when any entity kind of makes interventions, things can arise as a consequence of issues not foreseen at the beginning. We feel like through a huge kind of range of consultation that we've done, that we've got a pretty good handle on possible issues, and we're already coming up with mitigating factors. But that's why we need to make sure that we're evaluating this, and it probably needs to be people that aren't necessarily inside NAATI. So maybe making sure that we're drawing on external expertise where we're able to do that.
But a lot of this evaluation and monitoring is going to be based on the data that NAATI receives from the LSP directly. So how can NAATI guarantee that the data is going to be accurate?
It's a good question. Look, in many ways, the model is predicated on good faith. That question you have asked is also true in many other areas. So a government might require information from a provider to provide a grant of funding. It is often put in the documentation the provider needs to be truthful at all times through that process. There's really nothing to say that a provider, and I'm not just talking about LSPs, I'm talking about anyone who applies for a grant here, that entity is deliberately not being truthful and commits fraud and those types of things. There's maybe nothing stopping a provider from being mistruthful, but we're also having really positive conversations with most of the providers to understand that they are generally operating in good faith. And because NAATI is not going anywhere, it will be having an ongoing relationship with those endorsed providers, meeting regularly, discussing the data that it provides, accepting anonymous complaints from across the sector about the conduct of a provider. Suffice to say that if you were not operating in good faith, I don't think it would take very long for someone to find out.
Yeah. So practitioners and clients will also have the ability to give direct feedback to NAATI. Is that correct?
That's right. So NAATI has a complaints policy now, which obviously goes really to NAATI tests and credentials. But this is effectively a new product that NAATI will be establishing. So we are looking at that complaints policy around, well, what updates do we need to make to give providers the confidence that we're receiving complaints fairly, treating them appropriately, but allowing any person who might be concerned to raise an issue in a confidential way and know that it'll be taken seriously. So, yes.
And that's going to be through email. Is it going to be available through the website? How are practitioners going to have the ability to give feedback?
Look, well, good question. You mean feedback in terms of complaints or just general feedback?
Well, I just assumed you could give feedback even on a positive note, but sure, complaints are probably the most important matter.
No, sure. So I suppose a lot of that detail is being worked out at the moment in terms of how to lodge a concern or provide positive feedback. I think at the moment the current complaints policy allows an individual to provide written feedback, and there is material on the NAATI website about that policy. I wouldn't imagine there'd be a major deviation from the current policy, other than us needing to promote that so people are aware of how to raise issues or provide feedback when they have that. In terms of feedback now, and I don't know if this preempts a future question you might have, but we are still taking a lot of feedback on the model. It hasn't been finalised yet, and so in terms of any practitioners that are on this listening to this podcast, we'd love you to participate. We're doing kind of weekly consultation group meetings that happen every Wednesday afternoon throughout October. So the first is tomorrow. I'm not sure when you're publishing this, but the first is tomorrow. probably a bit too soon, but the week after is fine.
We'll make sure to include the dates of the consultation below the video of the podcast.
Of course. But I'll put a link. I can also share with you a link to where people can find out more.
Yeah, perfect. And on that note, there's also, for those who don't know, you can find the draft of the model on the NAATI website for you to look at as well. If you want to have a bit of a better understanding of everything we've been discussing. And we have been discussing all the measures that are going to be applied to LSPs. We've discussed the role of NAATI a little bit as well, but there is also partnership measures included in the model. Now, what exactly are these partnership commitments, and why have they been included in the model?
Well, great questions, because take people back to April of this year when NAATI put out a survey or discussion paper about what the sector would like to see in an LSP endorsement model. What are the things that providers should be required to do? What's interesting about that was actually a huge chunk of the feedback that came in were things like provide more PD or make it easier to network. Things that didn't really neatly sit with a provider per se to meet as a requirement of bidding for a tender, but they were something that another entity could or should be doing in support of the sector more broadly. So I suppose they were things where we thought, hey, people have gone through a process to provide input on things they consider to be important, rather than kind of discard all those things and focus purely on what a provider needs to do. Well, how can the rest of the sector come on this journey? It does need heavy lifting, and frankly, I don't think the providers are responsible for absolutely all of it. Governments are too. NAATI is a government-owned entity. It has a role in that as well. And so that's where those kind of partnership model ideas were born. So a practical one, just to share with you, where we say that, I touched on this earlier, I suppose, but when NAATI, the model kind of says you should be using NAATI certified interpreters and translators, one of those measures that NAATI is kind of offering to take forward is to pay the cost to get those individuals tested and to get them through, at least in an initial stage. And that might extend beyond that as well. That might include elements of training. We're still working through that. NAATI's obviously since published a $1 million scholarship fund. There's details about that. So I suppose that's what the partnership measures are designed to do, to get around the model to be a bit more holistic in what it addresses. Yeah.
So for partners in the wider industry, what are the benefits to be partner in this sense? How is it going to be incentivized that partners are going to be supporting this?
Yeah, well, it depends, I suppose, on who is partnering. I think in a lot of ways, especially for NAATI and especially for governments, so Australian state and territory governments, they have certain obligations around access and equity. So, tax-paying citizens who may not have a high level of English language proficiency need to engage with essential services, both for their immediate need, but also to support, government to deliver services efficiently and very safely. So they have an inherent interest in wanting to be a supporter of something that I suppose uplifts our ability to meet those needs. So I think at a core level, there are kind of direct policy implications that would necessitate a government wanting to be directly engaged in supporting that. And I also think there's probably like social license as well, that there are other NGOs and others in the sectors that will want to provide material if and as it arrives. So we talked a little bit about a public awareness campaign, like why do I need to use an interpreter? We hear that a lot, particularly of across Anglo audiences who may not have a lot of people with limited English proficiency around them. When you say, I've even seen on a hospital envelope recently, bring your sibling if you can't speak English. It's in one sense, and it's probably naive or ignorant, might even be a bit of a harsher term. If you have never thought about these issues before, it makes total sense why you'd say, just bring your sister, you don't understand. You only know what you know. But when someone explains the reasons why that's probably a bad idea, it becomes very obvious. Oh, of course. That's so. I do.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think
No.
most
Sorry.
of
Yeah.
no, that I shouldn't have interrupted you, but I think
No.
most of our listeners will have had the experience of knowing a person who is bilingual, and they might just go to the doctor's appointment with their parents because they think, oh yeah, I can do it. Why should I get an interpreter? And it's a natural thing to think, and I think it's very important that we work on that awareness, because you don't realize the consequences if you've never experienced them, of course.
That's right. I think you need a level of lived experience, or certainly to have been engaged enough on particular issues to then have a greater appreciation of it. That's kind of my whole interest in even being involved in this sector. I don't speak another language, and not particularly well. I won't try and speak Spanish with you. I don't speak particularly well, but it's because I kind of understand, like, it's almost a level of injustice, to be honest, for many people to try and engage with what I just know I have access to through nothing other than the luck of being born in a family that speaks English and having a greater awareness of that. And I do think that we will just get a lot of people who understand that but may not have the types of products to easily share, that if we're developing those kinds of products, hopefully people are just passing on those positive messages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess to finish our episode today, how are we going to know that the model is actually working? How are you going to be evaluating that? Who is going to be evaluating it as well?
Yeah, okay. So I suppose I touched on part of that earlier. I don't know who will be evaluating it yet, only that we are having very active conversations about that right now. It does need to be someone with a level of expertise and someone with an independent lens that can kind of provide advice back to NAATI, but also importantly, state governments and territory governments that own NAATI as well. How will we know it has worked? I have to say, and maybe this is an appropriate spot to end on, this is a very complex sector. It is much like a big 1,000 piece puzzle jigsaw sitting on a table, and unfortunately, there are a number of pieces missing from that picture. Not one, there are a number of them. So things like, remuneration might sit over here, or a legal requirement in a court case or set of court cases might be over here, or a particular cultural group that doesn't neatly fit into these requirements might be over here. This is a big puzzle piece. It's an important puzzle piece, but it's not the puzzle. We need to put this piece in place, but we need to take a step back and kind of think about, well, how can we each support each other to kind of fill the rest of the pieces that are missing? I do think it will take years to do this properly, because we need to see the model get put into place, us evaluate it, improve certain pieces that might, elements that might not be right, and then see that roll out across all states and territories through their own kind of tendering processes for it to have, I suppose, a more substantial impact on the market. The use of certified translators and interpreters. I have to also say, as a complete side note here, I know I've used credentials and certifications, so we're all learning here. I'm using these terms interchangeably, so I'm sure many of your listeners will pick up on that. So I do apologise. but that is to say that this is important, but it will take time, much like anything that heads in a good direction, and also often things that head in a bad direction. They take time to get right. So please do be patient with us, but provide the feedback along the way. It will be helpful.
Yes, that's great to hear, and it's good to know that there is the idea of reviewing it and updating it moving forward, I suppose, in order to respond to the demands of the sector as well as they develop in the future. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the model before we finish up?
No, I think that's covered most of it. I have been really positively impressed by the level, not of just interest, but I suppose contributions in terms of how to make this work equitably. I suppose there is a risk sometimes of viewing the providers or some of the big kind of LSPs as being kind of necessarily responsible for driving the state of the sector, which in certain elements might be true for certain subcomponents, but not necessarily the truth for everything, because, we really want to see governments setting standards that are equitable, that create a real floor, so that providers who are often operating without any floor, trying to guess what that should be and how they can remain competitive, they're often kind of driven by virtue of there being no standard to kind of do that. So I suppose that's just to say that as long as we're kind of all working in the one direction, we should see some positive change. And in fact, many of the suggestions I've had in terms of kind of making things more rigorous has come directly from the providers themselves. So that's just to provide a brief anecdote and say that we can all have different positions and be representing a different area, or whether you're representing yourself. But if we're doing it jointly and we're being respectful and considerate, I do like to think that we're going to get to a better position. And maybe it's just me being wildly ambitious and positive, but I do feel like things are going to improve.
I think from somebody that works in the industry, it's very encouraging and positive to see that the government is showing interest towards the industry. And so thank you for your work, and thank you for coming to the podcast, of course.
No worries. We will just, total plug for the AusIT conference in November, because there'll be a range of us speaking there, including I'll speak a little bit about this model, and by that time we should have gone through a lot of the consultation, so we will be in a kind of a place to be able to kind of share precisely what each of those measures will look like. So if you've got listeners or interested practitioners that are thinking about coming to Canberra, come on up or down.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Leigh. Enjoy
You're
the
very
rest of your
welcome.
day. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Conversations Podcast.